Your savings are worth less today than they were yesterday. Your salary doesn't stretch as far. The price of everything, from gasoline to groceries, feels impossibly high. You feel poorer, and you are. This isn't a feeling, it's a mathematical certainty. But what if I told you this wasn't an accident? What if I told you it wasn't the byproduct of a pandemic or a distant war or corporate greed? What if I told you it was a deliberate act, a meticulously executed plan, a heist? Welcome to the largest, most audacious financial crime of the 21st century. I call it the Great Inflation Heist. Over the last 4 years, an institution operating with the full faith and credit of the United States government systematically stole nearly 30% of the value of America's money. It was a theft so subtle, so complex, that most people never saw it happening. They just felt the consequences. They felt the slow, grinding erosion of their wealth, the evaporation of their savings, the tightening of their household budgets. The perpetrator of this crime isn't a masked bandit or a shadowy syndicate. It's an organization housed in a marble building in Washington, D.C. An organization with a dual mandate to maintain price stability and maximum employment, which, in a tragic irony, has failed catastrophically at the former while using the latter as its justification. The perpetrator is the Federal Reserve. The loot in this heist wasn't a stack of gold bars or a vault full of cash. It was something far more valuable and far more insidious. The loot was your purchasing power, the fundamental value of every single dollar you have ever earned, saved, or invested. And the scale of this theft is staggering. We are talking about trillions of dollars in value, siphoned out of the pockets of the American public and transferred elsewhere. Every great heist needs a distraction, a moment of chaos and confusion that draws all eyes away from the real action. The distraction for the great inflation heist was perfect, a global pandemic. In early 2020, as the world locked down and fear gripped the markets, the American public was looking for a savior. They were looking for stability. And the Federal Reserve, alongside the US Treasury, stepped forward, promising to do whatever it took to keep the economy afloat. They promised to be the lender of last resort, the guarantor of financial stability. What they didn't tell you was the price of that stability. They didn't tell you that their solution involved quietly executing the largest monetary debasement in modern history. They weaponized the crisis. They used public fear as cover to enact policies that would have been unthinkable in normal times. They presented themselves as firefighters, rushing into a burning building. But they weren't just carrying a fire hose, they were carrying canisters of gasoline. They didn't just put out the fire, they set the stage for a much larger, much more destructive conflagration down the road. An inflationary fire that would burn through the savings of a nation. This is the story of how they did it. It's a story about a printing press that doesn't use ink, a cover-up built on a single, misleading word and a getaway plan that ensured the architects of the crisis were also its greatest beneficiaries. This is the story of how the Fed stole 30% of America's money. And it starts not with a bang, but with a keystroke. The central question in any crime is how. How was it done? In the Great Inflation Heist, the weapon wasn't a gun, it was a spreadsheet. The tool wasn't a crowbar, it was a keyboard. The method is known by a deceptively boring name, quantitative easing. QE, you've heard the term. It's been presented as a sophisticated, almost magical tool for economic management. The reality is far more brutish. At its core, quantitative easing is the process of the central bank creating new money out of thin air to buy financial assets. Let me repeat that. It is the creation of money from nothing. It is not tax revenue. It is not borrowed from another country. It is conjured into existence with a few keystrokes on a computer. This newly created digital currency is then used by the Federal Reserve to purchase assets, primarily US Treasury bonds and mortgage-backed securities, from commercial banks. Why do they do this? The official explanation is that it lowers long-term interest rates, encourages lending, and stimulates economic activity. But let's look at what actually happens. When the Fed buys $1 billion worth of bonds from a bank, the bank's balance sheet changes. It now has $1 billion in new reserves, cash, and the Fed has the bonds. This injection of liquidity is supposed to trickle down into the economy. That's the theory. But what happened beginning in March of 2020 was not a trickle, it was a biblical flood. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet, which is the record of all the assets it has purchased, had already grown significantly since the 2008 financial crisis, sitting at a historically high level of around $4.2 trillion. The public had been largely pacified into believing this was the new normal. But what came next dwarfed everything that had come before. Between March 2020 and the spring of 2022, the Fed's balance sheet more than doubled. It exploded from $4.2 trillion to nearly $9 trillion. Think about that number. In the span of about 2 years, the Federal Reserve created more money on its balance sheet than it had in its entire 100-plus year history from its founding in 1913 through the crisis of 2008 and the decade that followed. $5 trillion conjured into existence. This wasn't happening in a vacuum. This monetary expansion was the accomplice to an unprecedented fiscal expansion. While the Fed was creating trillions, the US government was running multi-trillion-dollar deficits, fueled by massive spending packages like the $2.2 trillion CARES Act and the $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan. Now a crucial question arises. Who was buying all the debt the government was issuing to pay for this spending? Traditionally, this debt is bought by investors, foreign governments, pension funds, and individuals. But the sheer volume of new debt was too massive for the market to absorb without interest rates skyrocketing. And this is where the two arms of the heist, the Treasury and the Fed, worked in perfect, devastating harmony. The Treasury would issue new bonds to fund the stimulus checks and government programs. And the Federal Reserve, with its newly created money, would step into the market and buy a massive portion of those very bonds. This process is called debt monetization. It is the modern equivalent of a king clipping the edges off his kingdom, coins, to pay his soldiers. It is the most ancient and dishonest form of government finance. They were in effect printing the money to pay for the government's spending. The evidence for this is not hidden in some secret ledger. It is publicly available on the Federal Reserve's own website. The data series to watch is M2 money supply. M2 is a broad measure of the total amount of money in the US economy. It includes physical cash, checking accounts, savings accounts, and money market funds. It represents the pool of dollars available to be spent by ordinary people and businesses. In February of 2020, the M2 money supply stood at approximately $15.5 trillion. By May of 2022, it had ballooned to over $21.7 trillion. That is an increase of more than $6 trillion. A 40% increase in the entire stock of US dollars in just over 2 years. Never before in the history of the United States has the money supply been expanded so recklessly, so rapidly. This is the smoking gun of the great inflation heist. This is the act itself. When you increase the supply of something by 40%, while the supply of goods and services in the economy remains relatively fixed or even constrained, the laws of supply and demand are inescapable. The value of each unit, each dollar, must fall. It's not that the price of gasoline went up, it's that the value of the dollar in your pocket went down. It's not that a loaf of bread became more valuable. It's that the dollar you used to buy it became less valuable. The architects of this policy are not ignorant of this principle. It is Economics 101. The relationship between money supply and inflation has been understood for centuries. Economist Milton Friedman famously stated it most clearly. Inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon, in the sense that it is and can be produced only by a more rapid increase in the quantity of money than in output. They knew what they were doing. They knew that flooding the economy with trillions of new dollars would inevitably lead to a severe debasement of the currency. They knew it would lead to price inflation, but they did it anyway. They created the conditions for the crime. They loaded the gun. And in the months and years that followed, the American public would discover that it was aimed directly at their financial security. The mechanism of the heist was in place. The next phase was to convince the victims that nothing was wrong. The next phase was the cover-up. Every successful heist requires a brilliant cover story. An alibi. A narrative so compelling it makes the victims doubt their own senses. For the great inflation heist, the cover story was built around a single, powerful word, transitory. As prices began to creep up in the spring of 2021, the public started to get nervous. The cost of lumber, used cars, and shipping containers was soaring. But the officials at the Federal Reserve, led by Chairman Jerome Powell, remained calm. They took to the podiums and the television cameras with a unified, soothing message. Yes, they acknowledged there was some inflation, but it was nothing to worry about. It was merely transitory. Let's dissect this word. Transitory. It implies something temporary, fleeting, a short-term anomaly that will resolve itself. It was the perfect word to lull the public and the markets into a false sense of security. It was designed to prevent panic. It was designed to obscure the truth. The official narrative, repeated ad nauseam throughout 2021, was that inflation was being caused by a series of unfortunate but temporary events. First, it was supply chain bottlenecks. The pandemic had disrupted global logistics. They said, once the ports cleared up and factories reopened, prices would come back down. It was a plausible story. It was also a convenient misdirection. While supply chain issues certainly contributed to price increases in specific sectors, they could not explain the broad-based, economy-wide increase in the price level. A supply shock in lumber doesn't explain why the price of a steak, a gallon of milk, and your rent were all going up simultaneously. Only one thing can do that: a debasement of the currency itself. When the supply chain excuse began to wear thin, the narrative shifted. Suddenly, the inflation problem was a result of pent-up demand. Consumers, flush with stimulus cash, were simply spending too much. This narrative was particularly cynical. The very money that the Fed and Treasury had created and injected into the economy was now being blamed on the people for spending it. They lit the fire and then blamed the public for feeling the heat. Then, in early 2022, they were gifted another scapegoat. When Russia invaded Ukraine, the official line changed again. The surge in prices was now Putin's price hike. The war undoubtedly drove up energy and food prices globally. But to blame the entirety of American inflation, which had already been running at 40-year highs for months before the invasion, on a regional conflict in Eastern Europe was a deliberate and calculated act of deception. It was an attempt to pin a domestic policy failure on a foreign villain. The final act in this theater of the absurd was to blame corporate greed. Politicians declared that inflation was the fault of greedy corporations who were using the pandemic as an excuse to price gouge consumers. This is perhaps the most economically illiterate argument of all. Are we to believe that corporations only became greedy in 2021? Was there no corporate greed in 2019, when inflation was below 2%? Corporate greed is a constant. It cannot explain a sudden and dramatic change in the price level. Businesses will always try to charge the highest price the market will bear. The reason they could suddenly charge more was not because they became more greedy, but because consumers had more and less valuable dollars to spend. Each of these narratives, supply chains, pent-up demand, Putin's price hike, corporate greed, served a single purpose: to distract from the elephant in the room, to distract from the $6 trillion increase in the M2 money supply, to distract from the Fed's $9 trillion balance sheet. They were trying to convince you to look everywhere except at the source. They were like magicians waving one hand to perform a dazzling trick of misdirection, while the other hand picked your pocket. Chairman Powell himself, in testimony after testimony, insisted that the inflationary pressures were transitory. In a July 2021 press conference, he stated, "We will see inflation moving down." And we've been saying that this is going to be a transitory period of inflation. By November 2021, with inflation continuing to accelerate, he was finally forced to admit defeat. In a now infamous moment during a Senate Banking Committee hearing, he said, "I think it's probably a good time to retire that word." The retirement of the word transitory was an admission of failure, but it was not an admission of guilt. There was no apology. There was no acknowledgement that their own monetary policy was the primary driver of the crisis. The cover-up had succeeded. It had bought them time. It had confused the public and muddied the waters for over a year. By the time they admitted the problem was real, the heist was already complete. The value had been stolen. The wealth had been transferred. And the next phase of the operation, the getaway, was already well underway. The most important question in any heist is not how it was done, but for whom. Who benefits? Where does the stolen value end up? In the great inflation heist, the getaway was not a mad dash for the border. It was a quiet, legal, and systematic transfer of wealth from the bottom 90% of the population to the top 10%. The mechanism for this transfer is a little known but powerful economic principle called the Cantillon effect. Named after the 18th century Irish-French economist Richard Cantillon, this effect describes the fact that newly created money does not enter the economy evenly. It is not dropped from a helicopter, as some economic models might suggest. Instead, it is injected at specific points, and the people closest to that injection point benefit the most. Those who receive the new money first get to spend it before prices have had a chance to rise. By the time that money filters down to the rest of the population, prices have already increased, and their purchasing power is diminished. Inflation, therefore, is not just a uniform tax on everyone. It is a regressive tax and a vehicle for wealth redistribution. It is a transfer of wealth from those who are last to receive the new money. The wage earners, the savers, the retirees on fixed incomes, to those who are first in line. And who is first in line? The primary dealers, the large commercial and investment banks that do business directly with the Federal Reserve. They are the first recipients of the new reserves created through quantitative easing. They get the fresh, high-powered money first. Second, the government itself. It gets to spend the trillions of dollars on its programs and stimulus payments before that money has circulated and driven up prices across the economy. Third, the owners of financial assets. The massive liquidity injection from the Fed has to go somewhere, and its first stop is financial markets. This is not a bug. It is a feature. The stated goal of QE is to inflate asset prices to create a wealth effect, hoping that people who feel richer will spend more. But what it really does is enrich those who already own the assets. Let's look at the evidence. In the period from March 2020 through the end of 2021, while the Fed was creating trillions of dollars, the S&P 500 soared by over 70%. The Nasdaq more than doubled. The housing market went into a frenzy, with the Case-Shiller Home Price Index rising by nearly 40%. The cryptocurrency market, the art market, the market for luxury watches, every financial asset imaginable experienced a historic bubble. This was the Cantillon effect playing out in real time. The new money flowed directly into Wall Street, creating spectacular paper gains for investors, corporate executives, and the wealthiest sliver of society. Billionaires in the United States saw their collective wealth increase by over $2 trillion during the pandemic. Major banks reported record profits. Private equity firms and hedge funds reaped massive windfalls. They got to spend the new money while it was still valuable, bidding up the prices of stocks, bonds, and real estate. Now consider the other side of this equation. The victims, the last people to receive the new money, are the ones who live on Main Street. The hourly wage worker, the salaried employee, the small business owner, the retiree living on a pension. They do not benefit from the initial asset price inflation. They only experience the consequences. The higher prices at the gas pump and the grocery store. Their wages might eventually go up, but they always lag behind prices. For nearly 2 years straight, from May 2021 to March 2023, real average hourly earnings in the United States were negative. This means that even if you got a raise, the increase in your cost of living was even higher. You were getting paid more, but you were falling further behind. Your labor was being devalued. The savers were punished even more severely. Anyone who acted responsibly, who put money aside in a savings account or a certificate of deposit was a guaranteed loser. The Federal Reserve held interest rates at zero during this entire period. So while inflation was running at 5, 6, 7, even 9%, the interest you earned on your savings was effectively zero. Every single day the money you had saved for a down payment, for your children's education, or for your retirement was losing value. It was melting like an ice cube on a hot sidewalk. This is the getaway. This is the heart of the heist. The creation of $6 trillion was not just an act of economic mismanagement, it was an act of mass redistribution. It was a transfer of purchasing power from the hands of the many to the pockets of the few, from the prudent saver to the leveraged speculator, from the worker to the capital owner, from Main Street to Wall Street. The Cantillon effect ensures that the perpetrators of monetary debasement are also its primary beneficiaries. It is the perfect crime, where the criminals get to write the laws and also walk away with all the loot. And once the getaway was complete, all that was left was to manage the aftermath. After the heist, the cover-up, and the getaway, comes the final act, the hangover, the inevitable painful consequences of the preceding policy decisions. By mid-2022, the inflation created by the Federal Reserve was no longer deniable. It had reached a 4-decade high and the public was angry. The political pressure to do something became immense. And so, the very institution that caused the problem presented itself as the only one capable of solving it. The Federal Reserve, having doused the economy in the gasoline of monetary expansion, now appointed itself the sole firefighter. Its solution: to slam on the brakes as hard as it had previously stomped on the accelerator. Beginning in March of 2022, the Fed embarked on the most aggressive interest rate hiking cycle in 40 years. It raised the federal funds rate from near zero to over 5% in little more than a year. The stated purpose was to crush inflation by cooling down the economy. But let's be clear about what this really means. Raising interest rates is a blunt instrument. It works by making it more expensive for businesses to borrow and invest, and for consumers to borrow and spend. It increases the cost of mortgages, car loans, and credit card debt. The goal is to deliberately slow down economic activity, to destroy demand. In blunter terms, the Fed's solution to the inflation it created is to make the economy weaker, to put people out of work, and to potentially trigger a recession. This is the second phase of the crime. The victims of the heist are punished once again. First, their savings were devalued by inflation. Now their jobs are put at risk by the so-called cure for that inflation. The small business owner who survived the pandemic now faces crippling borrowing costs. The family looking to buy a home is now priced out by soaring mortgage rates. The worker in a cyclical industry faces the prospect of layoffs as the economy contracts. Notice the cruel logic at play. The Fed created an asset bubble with 0% interest rates and quantitative easing, benefiting the wealthy. Then, to fight the inflation that resulted, they jacked up interest rates, which disproportionately harms wage earners and small businesses. The gains were privatized for the few, while the pain of the cleanup is socialized among the many. This entire process is presented to the public as a difficult but necessary choice. We are told we must choose between the poison of rampant inflation and the medicine of a painful recession. It is the illusion of choice. It is a false dichotomy designed to absolve the central planners of their culpability. They created the disease and now they demand applause for administering a painful and potentially lethal cure. We were never offered the real choice, the choice of sound money, the choice of a responsible fiscal policy that doesn't rely on debt monetization, the choice of a central bank that prioritizes long-term price stability over short-term market bailouts. Furthermore, the Fed's tightening cycle created its own form of financial instability. The rapid increase in interest rates caused the value of long-term bonds, which banks had loaded up on during the zero interest rate period, to plummet. This led directly to the banking crisis of March 2023, which saw the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank, Signature Bank, and the emergency rescue of First Republic. The Fed's solution broke the financial system, requiring yet another bailout, yet another injection of liquidity to calm the markets. They are trapped in a cycle of their own making, creating bubbles with easy money, popping them with tight money, and then having to create more easy money to clean up the mess. The aftermath of the great inflation heist is a landscape of economic carnage, a public whose wealth has been permanently diminished, a financial system made fragile and dependent on central bank intervention, and an institution, the Federal Reserve, that refuses to accept responsibility for the crisis it engineered, instead positioning itself as the indispensable manager of our economic fortunes. The hangover is deep, the pain is real, and the architects of the problem remain firmly in control. So where does this leave us? Let's recap the evidence. The case is closed. The verdict is in. The crime was the great inflation heist. The motive was the desire to fund unprecedented government spending and to bail out financial markets, all without raising direct taxes. The opportunity was a global pandemic that provided the perfect cover of chaos and fear. The mechanism was a 40% expansion of the M2 money supply in 2 years, driven by trillions of dollars of quantitative easing and debt monetization. This was the act of theft, the deliberate debasement of our nation's currency. The cover-up was the persistent and dishonest narrative that the resulting inflation was transitory, blaming everything from supply chains to corporate greed to foreign wars, anything to avoid admitting the monetary origins of the crisis. The getaway was the Cantillon effect, a systematic and brutally effective transfer of wealth. The newly created money flowed first to Wall Street and the government, inflating asset prices and enriching the already wealthy, while the ensuing price inflation impoverished savers, wage earners, and retirees. And the aftermath is the painful hangover of high interest rates, economic uncertainty, and a central bank that now uses the threat of recession to clean up the inflationary mess it made, punishing its victims for a second time. The total damage? A cumulative increase in the consumer price index of over 20% since the beginning of 2020. This means that, on average, the dollar in your pocket has lost 1/5 of its purchasing power. But even that official number, which is notorious for understating the true cost of living, doesn't capture the full scale of the theft. The massive inflation in asset prices, like housing, has pushed the dream of ownership out of reach for an entire generation. When you factor in the true cost of housing, food, energy, and education, the real loss of purchasing power for the average American is closer to 30%. Nearly a third of the value of your money gone. Transferred, stolen. This was not just a policy mistake. A mistake is an error made in good faith. When you pursue a course of action that economic history and theory have repeatedly shown will lead to a specific destructive outcome, that is not a mistake. It is a choice. It was a choice to sacrifice the stability of the currency for the sake of bailing out a dysfunctional system. It was a choice to sacrifice the purchasing power of the poor and the middle class to protect the asset portfolios of the rich. This was an economic fraud perpetrated on a scale that is difficult to comprehend. It was a stealth tax levied not by Congress, but by an unelected committee of central bankers. It was a betrayal of the Federal Reserve's core mandate to maintain price stability. The great tragedy is that there is no one to hold accountable. The actions of the Fed were all technically legal. The architects of this heist will face no court, no jury. They will retire to lucrative positions in the private sector they so dutifully served. They will write memoirs and give speeches, hailed as the saviors who steered us through a difficult time. But we must not forget what really happened. We must understand the nature of the fiat currency system we live in, a system that gives a small group of people the power to create money from nothing, a power that is inevitably abused. We must recognize that inflation is not some mysterious economic weather pattern. It is a policy choice, and it is a choice that has victims. The great inflation heist is over. The money is gone, but the knowledge of how it was done and why is our only defense against it happening again. The security of your financial future depends on understanding that the most dangerous threats to your wealth may not come from foreign adversaries or market crashes, but from the very institutions that claim to be protecting it. They are not the guardians of the currency. They are the architects of its debasement, and they have proven, beyond any reasonable doubt, that they are capable of pulling off the perfect crime, right in plain sight.